G'day all. A little bit now on assessment, and I know that somewhere in your degree there definitely will be an assessment course, very likely at least convened by my colleague Katie Weir, even if you have a different tutor. And she's the expert on assessment. She will know what she's doing. I may have mentioned this in another video as well. But I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about assessment for a couple of reasons. And to be honest, this is almost a political statement. I am kind of against the Greens background and I am a member of the Greens, but it's not that kind of political statement. This is talking about how we as professional educators respond to the environment around us, the political environment in the context in which teaching and learning happens. So, but you know, it's not only that, it's about some of the things about how we assess well. So I won't get you to, if you like, stop the video for a couple of minutes and just think by yourself, what assessment task that you've completed, either in your degree or at school or in some other context, what assessment task that you've completed have you enjoyed the most? What was the best one that you've ever done? And it might be, say, your black belt taekwondo grading. You know, it needn't be a written paper and pencil test. It's an assessment. It's a skill test or a knowledge test of some kind. What was the one that you enjoyed most and why? And what was the one that you enjoyed least and why? What are the criteria that you're using to make those judgments about what's good assessment, or at least what's enjoyable assessment? And, you know, we could talk about whether good assessment is necessarily enjoyable and vice versa. But think for a moment about the assessments that you've done and reflect on your own reaction to them as a student, because obviously that helps to contextualize what you'll do as a teacher. The notion of evaluation is placing a value on something. Evaluation is judging whether something is good or not. We evaluate students' learning and give them a grade. We evaluate our own teaching by reflecting, and other people will evaluate our teaching as well. We have to go from provisional to full teacher registration, for example. We might have our head of department or a deputy or the principal come and observe our teaching and so on. People from the university will probably observe our teaching at some point during placements. But we're evaluating the activity, not the person. We are saying you have learned this to a certain standard. We're not saying you're a good person or you're a bad person. And sometimes it can feel to the student as though we're judging them. And so we need to go bend over backward to make sure that it's clear that it's not, you know, you've done terribly. It's this work is not of a high standard. Here's how you can improve it. Assessment is measurement of something. It can be qualitative or quantitative. There are a number of ways you can think of kinds of assessment. But assessment, the results of these measurements, are the evidence we use to make our evaluation. So an evaluation is a value judgment about how good or otherwise something is, and it's based on evidence from assessment, from the measurements that we've made of the quality of experiences. So, you know, something like in a dance performance, for example, it's probably not going to be in marks, although ballroom dancing, I think they do use scorecards like they use in the Olympic ice skating. But, you know, it's much more an aesthetic appreciation, a judgment about that quality of that particular performance that's made. Validity and reliability. If you have a psychological background, you're probably cringing, but this is the very, very quick, easy, for teachers, for our purposes, understanding. So validity is, does the assessment task measure what it says it measures? So, for example, if you have a science assessment task, but the English language used in it is so highfalutin and complicated and uses so much jargon that it's really a test of reading comprehension, not a test of science knowledge, then it's not a valid assessment. The thing has to assess what it claims that it's assessing, and there need to be no barriers to it being able to accurately assess the thing that it's meant to be assessing. And then reliability is, if you did the same task to the same students under the same circumstances, would you get the same result? So is it not vulnerable to random factors outside the system? Can you rely on it to give you comparable results this year and next year, for example, and between classes and across contexts and so on? So those are criteria for judging the assessment tasks we create. I'm not going to talk about moderation today because actually it was a real feature of the previous senior secondary regime in Queensland, but it's not really much of a feature of the current system. So I'll leave that aside on the side of our plate. We assess for a number of reasons. Some of those, I would argue, are valid educational reasons, some of them aren't. So I would argue that using assessment of student learning to judge teacher performance is fraught with all sorts of dangers, because the students bring a lot to the classroom that's not just what they get from the teacher. There are a whole range of other factors that are relevant in judging how students are learning that are not caused by the teacher. And in fact, if you look at John Hattie's work about the influences on student achievement, teaching, within school influences are relatively large, but by the time you break that down to an individual teacher and an individual class, it's really quite negligible. So ascribing the whole of the learning to that relatively small factor, I don't think is necessarily fair, and it's misusing the data that have been generated for a different purpose. Similarly, deciding who gets a university place. Now, university places in our society, for reasons that we've decided, are a scarce good. We've decided that there are caps on the numbers of students who can go to university, so therefore we need to select who gets to go and who doesn't. Now, that's not really an educative purpose. That's a resource management purpose. We could decide to apply enough resources to universities that anyone who wants to go could go. We've decided not to. We've decided to make it a scarce good in some sense, and therefore we have to have these selection processes, and they influence school quite a lot, but they're not really about education per se. They're about selection. But there is evaluation and assessment that is directly for learning. So assessment is a communication system with students. When we mark, when we set a task, when we give them feedback and information on a task, we are signaling them about what constitutes a good performance. When they ask, is this on the exam or does this count? It's sometimes frustrating because we love science, we love the knowledge that we're teaching, we want them to want to know it for its own sake. And so their obsession with assessment is sometimes frustrating, but it's completely fair. They're being judged on these criteria. And again, it's about making those rules of the knowledge game clear and explicit for them. So telling them exactly how to succeed is important. Equipping them with the tools to judge their own performance and figure out how to improve it is really important as a part of assessment. Assessment for learning is what I wanted to talk about in this video, basically, is assessment for student learning versus assessment for accountability. And the political context, which is why I talked about politics right at the start, has been to make it more and more about accountability, about checking and testing and checking up on and surveilling people, rather than about students, learning and what they actually know and what that can be used for. And this is a trend that we need to resist, I think. The formative-summative distinction, again, is one you're probably very familiar with. Formative is assessment that is used to give feedback to students that's not on the final report, but still very important. And we probably tend to underuse formative assessment. Summative assessment is recorded in final reporting and feedback of some kind, and sums up what students know and are able to do. Assessment for learning is diagnostic. It happens during the learning and it feeds information back to help those assessed, as I've emphasized on the slide, to be able to make judgments to enhance their learning. So we give the students feedback on parts A, B, and C of your assignment are great. Part D, you need to work more on X. And so assessment of learning is more like summative. It's used to make judgment about the quality of the learning that's already happened. But assessment for learning happens during and involves a lot of feedback. So summative assessment or assessment of learning, we also give feedback, but it's too late to do anything about it. So by the time you get your ATAR score or your OP number, it's too late to do anything about it, unless you go back to TAFE and do year 12 again or something. That's summative. It sums up what you know at a particular point in time. It doesn't sum up your personal worth, although, I was still being asked for my New South Wales HSC numbers when I was applying for master's degrees, which seems very weird to me because I'd already finished a bachelor's by that time. But that number says something about who you were when you were 17 or 18. It doesn't say much about anything else, in my opinion. Norm referenced and criterion referenced. It's language that you probably need to know. We don't do a lot of norm referenced in Australia now. Norm referenced assessment basically pre-specifies what the mean will be, usually 65, and what the standard deviation will be, usually 15. And if the student's marks don't fit that, uses various mathematical tools to force them to fit it. So if the students all do badly, for example, and nobody gets an A, then they will kind of force map them to the norm so that somebody does get an A. And vice versa, if the students all do too well, we'll push them back toward the norm. In Australia, we don't do that. We do what's called criterion referenced assessment, and you'll be very familiar with this from your degree. The criteria are specified ahead of time, and it's about the level at which you meet those criteria. And that's what we basically do in university, and that's what we also do in senior secondary. And it's important to create good criteria, well-written criteria, and criteria sheets, and I'll talk about that next week. The word repertoire keeps coming up, and I'll keep using it in my talks about these kind of topics. As a teacher, as a professional, you develop a repertoire of tools and skills. So you develop also a repertoire of assessment tasks and types. So it's not as simple as just lab book, written assignment, exam. In science, for example, there can also be performance assessments that you conduct in the lab where you observe them doing something. There can be field activities where they do some kind of other representation. There can be the creation of claymation videos or other kinds of representation that they create. There can be the development of animations and simulations. There's a whole variety of different assessment tasks that you can have, that you make valid and that you make linked to the kinds of things that you're actually wanting the students to demonstrate that they know and can do. Ideally, assessment is for metacognition, that your goal is for the students to actually be thinking about their thinking and learning about their learning, being able to actually make a judgment. And you know, I mean, for some, as it was for me, I got 312 out of 500 for my high school certificate, which is just over 60%, which is not spectacular, but that was enough to get me into any university in a Bachelor of Science in New South Wales at that time. So it was enough. It did what I needed it to do. I didn't particularly care about getting a higher mark than that because I had an instrumental focus on this is what I want to do with my life. And now I have a PhD and am an associate professor. So having that relatively unimpressive score hasn't held me back overly. Some students will be like that. Some students will be instrumental and want to particularly reach it. Some students won't give a crap at all. Pardon the French, but you know, some students don't really care about succeeding. We have to encourage and support them. I don't think it's fair for us as teachers to just go, your responsibility, little adolescent person with no developed brain yet. You just deal with the consequences of your actions. I don't think that's appropriate. But we have to kind of encourage, support, get them to the point where they can at least pass and be successful. And others will be like my younger brother, who was obsessed with getting excellent grades and spent all his time in his room studying during his teens, rather than the various other nefarious activities I was getting up to in my teens, and did get an excellent mark, and he is now a church pastor. So it hasn't particularly held him back either, but I don't know that it's particularly helped him either. He's done exactly what he wanted to do as well, but he's got a much more impressive number to show for it. So I think getting the students to make those judgments and be a bit more explicit and a bit more mature about what they're doing and why they're doing it and where they're heading. Catalytic validity is just the notion that it's a metaphor from science. A catalyst in chemistry makes a chemical reaction go faster and more efficiently where everything else is kept the same. So an assessment task that makes the learning more efficient has catalytic validity. So it's not just testing, it's not just providing evidence and feedback, it's also helping further learning, that it has catalytic validity, if that makes sense. Peer assessment is something I advocate a lot, and self-assessment. So I just talked about the metacognition, getting the students to be able to make judgments about their own work, getting them to self-assess, get them to mark their own work and tell you what mark they think it deserves, and then you can check it and agree or disagree with them. getting them to mark their peers' work and come back with that. It means that they are making judgments. It means that they're just not trying to be compliant with the criteria themselves. They have to use the criteria to say, oh, okay, that's what a good performance looks like. There's lots of research that shows that students are actually really good at this. You might assume that they would be bad at it and that they would give their mates high marks and their enemies low marks or whatever. But they've done lots of studies where high school students marked work and then experts marked the work, and the correlation was very high in terms of the marks. So using self and peer assessment is a really nice metacognitive tool. It might also save you some marking time, but that's not the main reason to do it. The main reason is that it does help students make those judgments and work at those higher order thinking skill levels. Alignment between curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, we kind of keep coming back to it, but it's one of those things where, if they're not aligned, then your course looks inauthentic and messy and not connected. So what are the things that we use to allow ourselves to make sure that the assessment measures the things that we actually think are important, and that we teach not to the test, but in a way that helps the students be able to succeed on the test. The test in this case being things including the science investigation and the science experiment where they write up a report. So I guess there are factors that increase the alignment and factors that decrease the alignment. I'd argue the new syllabus in some ways decreases alignment because it's more, in some sense, it's more rigidly controlled than the old, more progressive syllabus. But in other ways, it kind of helps with alignment in that it's very explicit. So you've got your list of cognitive verbs, you've got your list of criteria, you know exactly what the learning objectives are, what level the students need to demonstrate those at. You've got mandatory practical activities that everybody in the state does, and so on. So I think, it is tightly specified, and it does help, I think, with alignment, but it's thinking about how that all hangs together. Differentiation has a number of different levels. So on one level of differentiation, it's not deficit, but it is actually making sure that all students can be included. So some students might have a disability, red-green color blindness or something. So I might actually have been quite unhelpful to anyone who has that by choosing green background and green t-shirt for this video. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe my emphasis colors, using the orange as an emphasis in this particular video, is not helpful. Students may be deaf or hearing impaired and might need subtitles if we use video. They might be visually impaired and might need text readers if we use text. They might have issues with literacy or numeracy and not be working at the same level as their peers, so we need to account for that. They might be gifted and talented and find the pace that is appropriate for most students incredibly boring and stultifying and need extra extension work and so on. There's a whole variety of different special needs, which are not all deficits, they're just differences for which we might want to cater. There are different student interests, hobbies, engagements and so on. We tend to be very stereotyped and say, well, the girls will be interested in making lip gloss in the lab and the boys will be interested in making jet fuel or whatever it is, which is, pretty awful old sexist stuff. But there will be a range of different interests, and it may well be that some of the girls are into jet fuel and some of the boys are into lip gloss, and that's okay. So, trying to differentiate in that way as well, differentiating just for academic ability. Some will be working at a higher level than others. Differentiating for just backgrounds, languages. They may have just arrived from another country and have English as a second language. We need to cater for that and so on. So how do we actually deal with that and assess different things at different times? How do we assess, increase the variety while making the assessment fair? So is it appropriate if, say, a student has a real literacy and writing ability task, if everybody else in the class writes it and he gives it verbally to the teacher in a recorded session? Is that fair and appropriate? And are those marks directly comparable and so on? So we need to think about the ethics of that, making it fair for that student with the special need and making it fair for the rest of the students as well in terms of performance, and thinking about the different range of assessments and activities and tasks and challenges that we do. Yeah, I've just talked about differentiation as well, so I won't spend more time on that. could you have a range of different, could you have tasks which are differently weighted or differently used? Or, is it valid if half the students decide that they're going to make a video and the other half decide that they're going to create a rap, whatever it happens to be? How comparable do the contexts in which the students demonstrate their understanding have to be to make the assessment fair? There is a whole variety of ethics and issues around that. I think, again, you'll find that the new senior syllabus is quite constrained about that, because assessment tasks must be written, and certainly for the summative ones, must be written, sent off to the endorsement panel and endorsed before they can be implemented. And I think you'll find the endorsement panel will want you to give one common task to every student in your class, and probably every student in your school who's studying that subject. So I think, yeah, some of these judgments will kind of be made for you, or at least you'll have to be able to defend them in the context of the endorsement activities. I'm going to skip that bit as well. There's a variety of ways that we'll report results to parents, and that depends on the school community, where you work, whether you're in the state sector or Catholic, or the small independent Christian schools, or the kind of grammar school, the big wealthy school sector, or a whole variety of different sectors, or if you're working in TAFE, or if you're working overseas, or if you're working in a remote Indigenous community, and so on. So there's lots of different models that we use to report, and your school will have chosen a model that they consider appropriate. And just like that last line is hard-earned experience of mine. I've occasionally tried jokes in writing reports, and it's gone down like a lead balloon because the context wasn't clear and the parents didn't get it and thought I was disrespecting their child, and I wasn't. But so don't be clever, be clear, be concise, be honest, and just give information about the student, how they're doing. And I also think, again, from personal experience, this time as a student, think that could do better is a pretty friggin' useless comment. Of course I could do better, but I was happier riding trail bikes than I was studying. So I don't know, give them a comment that actually tells them how they can improve in some substantive way, rather than just suggesting that it's about effort. The notion of redeemable assessment and drafts. So do you let the students write drafts of their assignments, give them some feedback, and then they put in the final one, and so on? It can be expensive for the teacher in terms of time and work and energy and so on. Sometimes the students can do a fairly slack job the first time, hoping that the feedback will give them all the guidance they need to make an excellent one the second time, and so on. Other students will create something amazing the first time, and it's hard to find feedback to give. So yeah, I think we do some of that. Do we do redeemable assessment? That is, once the marks have already been given out, can a student come back and move from a fail to a pass? Griffith has systems and policies around this, like supplementary assessment and resubmission of assessment tasks and so on. So there are ways in which students can have an opportunity to more successfully demonstrate the knowledge than they managed on the first shot. Again, it's about making it fair for everybody. I don't think it should be possible for a student, for example, to go from a fail to an A or a 7 on a resubmit, because that seems unfair to the students who didn't have as much extra time. They should probably be able to go from a fail to a pass, and that's about it on a resubmit. And sometimes there might not be resubmits on particular tasks, depending on the needs and the purposes of the program or what's going on. But thinking about that, and thinking about how and when you use drafts, can you get them to get peer feedback on drafts rather than you having to do feedback on all the drafts? That might be a way to get them some feedback early in the process and get that good metacognitive peer assessment stuff going without creating an unfathomable and unmanageable workload for yourself. So a number of things you can do in this space. The idea of authentic and inauthentic assessment. Authentic assessment effectively means the assessment measures something about the real world. So alignment is one thing. Does the assessment measure what you actually taught, what's on the curriculum and what your pedagogy was? But this is slightly different. This is, is the task worth doing in the first place? If I ask students in this day and age, memorize the first 20 elements of the periodic table, I don't think that's an authentic task, because everybody has a device in their pocket which allows them to check that. I found it really useful. I did that many years ago and find it useful to be able to, off the top of my head, go that, nitrogen is before oxygen and those kind of things. But I don't think that that's a useful, authentic task. And, that's a very trivial example. But, are we teaching them and requiring them to do things that are completely pointless in the real world because of changes to technology or because of a whole range of other things? Or are we getting them to do genuinely authentic things? I've kind of alluded here to the notion that NAPLAN is not particularly authentic as an assessment task. Oh, don't let this go any further than just us. I'm not sure Landtight is particularly authentic as an assessment task either, but we have to do it. We're required to do it. So how do we make our assessment more authentic? And that partly is a task for the curriculum makers rather than just us plebs who have to teach from the syllabus documents in schools. Refuse, resist. This is this same figure that you've seen before, learning to accountability. And I would argue that the learning is the valid, the authentic, the appropriate thing, and the accountability is much less appropriate. The trend is toward accountability because politicians want to know that they're getting their money for their value for the money, the taxpayers' money that's invested in education. But I think it ends up being a negative force on education in terms of the actual goal of improving education. And certainly all the attention put into trying to do better on international tests like PISA and TIMSS and so on doesn't seem to be working. Despite all of this extra attention to assessment, Australia seems to be sliding backward in those scales. Maybe if the assessment was on learning rather than accountability, we would slide forward. I don't know. Or maybe if we resourced education properly. Again, I did say this is a little bit of a political rant. So I would argue that it's anti-educational to be all about accountability. We need to actually work towards, as education professionals, I think that, and I'm not going to indoctrinate you, you can decide that, in fact, it's all about accountability. I pay my taxes, damn it, and I think that everybody should be tested and checked at every opportunity and fill in boxes and tick off lists and so on. This is my view, is that really as an education profession, and not just as individuals, but collectively, through our unions, through our schools, through our professional associations, and so on. So STAC is the Science Teachers Association of Queensland. It's a member association of ASTA, the Australian Science Teachers Association. I would encourage you as science teachers to be members of STAC and therefore ASTA, to go to the STAC professional development experiences, to join, be part of the association and so on. And also, I personally would encourage you to join your union or your professional association if you're in private schools, because those are the ways that we as teachers work together collectively. If it's just the one hero teacher trying to make change, you can get burned out very quickly and get in trouble very quickly as well. So these changes are important, they are valid and valuable, but working together is important. And so hopefully, this last point is, I'm being slightly facetious, but I hope that what I've done is get you to think beyond just implementing what the system tells you should do, and to actually be a professional, to make judgments about the validity, authenticity, appropriateness of what the system asks you to do. And you can't change the system by yourself, but you can work in ways within the system to do the good stuff, and you can work collectively with others toward changing the system to do the good stuff. The stuff that's worthwhile, the stuff that actually serves Australian students who become Australian citizens, because that's what we're about. So I hope that that's been useful, hopefully maybe even a little bit infuriating and annoying, not too infuriating and annoying, but got you thinking in some new ways about what we're doing when we're doing assessment. Thanks a lot. See ya.